Toronto is a society which do a lot of Chinese studies, and we focus on Chinese traditional culture and also the modern culture of China. And we have many branches in Harvard University and the University of McGill. And the University of Toronto is the third branch of the North Shore Society in North America. And I was a great honor to be invited by the president of the society to be the moderator of today's lecture. So today's lecture is about HANFU, as I've mentioned. And I would like to briefly introduce our lecturer, our instructor, speaker of today's lecture. Her name is Juni Yeung. She's now a PhD student in history major at the University of Toronto. And she got her bachelor's degree from the U of T and her master's degree from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, also a very famous university in Hong Kong. And she starts her studies about this topic since many years ago. Sorry, I need to look at my cheat sheet. Since 2005, she started her Guqing Association at the U of T, which is now called the Toronto Guqing Society, is that right? And after that, she started her research about HANFU and the culture and the history about HANFU. And now, today, the lecture is not only about the costume itself, but also about the stories, the history, and the culture. So I was happy that you will come here and share the fashion, the old fashion, and also the modern fashion from the beginning of the time. So let's welcome our speaker.
So good evening, everybody. Can everyone hear me right? Okay, good. So yes, today's lecture will be a part of a two-part series known as the HANFU lecture series that I usually give to different societies. This variation of the lecture will be a bit more academic since we are in an academic setting. And this lecture will basically cover the classic issues of restoring this dress and its controversies. So in this lecture, we're going to focus on the material aspects or the changes in the material culture that is the HANFU movement, as well as give a historical context to the ideological, nationalistic, and other immaterial aspects that are involved in the wearing of traditional Chinese dress known as HANFU. And before I would like to continue on, I would like to show my thanks for the organizers today, including the University of Toronto North Shore Society. As well, I am honored by the presence of many of our classmates at University of Toronto Scarborough campus, and as well as the HCCA, the Han Chinese Culture Association of the University of Toronto Scarborough campus. And for technical expertise, there's always the Toronto Guqing Society at your service. And most importantly, of course, is everyone, listeners like you, coming to this lecture today that makes this whole lecture possible and successful. Thank you. So, before I get to the hard questions, I would like to ask the people here, has this ever happened to you? Namely, dressing up in robes or robing yourself in blankets and pretending that you're a princess or a prince from some historical era. Or imagining about it in your daydreams and scribbling. Or maybe it's computer games and other media that you have came in touch when you were little and you aspire to live like the ancients. So the whole point of the HANFU movement as we know it today comes from a very basic question. The dilemma of people who are born after the 1980s in China or elsewhere comes with a basic premise of why is the Chinese tradition so distant from our current memory? Namely, when we think about how Chinese people are dressed and presented themselves today, we usually think about people in Western dress. Or otherwise, they would wear these strange jackets known as Qipao Ma Hua, such as these two fine figures in the front, as we see here. But in any case, they look very different from the robes that you see in the back too. Why is that? And the people in the 1980s and 1990s kept on wondering, and unlike its previous generation, took it one step further. So with the influence of digital media as well as mass media, the pursuit of ancient eloquence becomes, the need for it becomes amplified as people wonder now with strong visual messages, why does this not exist for us to enjoy and share with the rest of the world? So the birth of the Huaxia Renaissance movement, or the Huaxia Fuxing Yundong, gave rise to the HANFU movement as we know it, partially out of the pursuit of these beautiful dress, and as well for a bunch of ideological reasons that happened with the onset of modernity since the opening reforms of Deng Xiaoping in 1976. And ultimately, it is a matter of not just the recent past, but also a continuation of over a century of revolutionary thought and nationalism in modern-day China. So let us cover what exactly happened 100 years ago. Before the Qing dynasty happened, basically, first of all, the Qing dynasty has banned outright the wearing of Han dress as a part of its assimilation plans in its empire. So until its downfall in 1911, this thing is outright illegal. And students who are studying in Japan overseas or publishing revolutionary material in the less guarded regions of the treaty ports in southern China started pondering by the end of the Qing dynasty about the identity of the Chinese ethnicity, namely with the Han Chinese. And one of the things that they propose is that by the onset of the new nation state that will be founded, they will be wearing a new sort of dress. And, quote, as early as this Xinhai Revolution, there were those who suggested for the revival of ancient dress, imitating to the Shui Bu Zhuan, the tales of the water margin, or martial outfits in the Seven Heroes and Five Gallants, Qi Xia Wu Yi, with high top knots on the head, tight-fitting inner clothes, and double-tied round-collared long robes. They were considered traditionally aesthetic, while also convenient and not forgetting of the martial spirit, namely the revolutionary spirit and militaristic spirit that brought to the rise of the new nation state and the downfall of the imperial Qing Empire. So in case you're wondering what this description is about, in the 1980s, this dress was actually sort of redeveloped for television drama, thanks to a Hong Kong television station TVB. And a lot of martial arts dramas actually revived this very spirit of the description, such as the top image. And the original references with the tales of the water margin, there are some traditional illustrations to point what they mean. And also, for the revolutionaries who thought of this idea up, while they were outside of the controls of the Qing Empire, they dressed freely in traditional Chinese robes in whatever fashion and means that they could, This usually involves employing Japanese tailors to make cross-colored robes that they call New Chinese robes. And one of the more outstanding examples is Zhang Bingli, or Zhang Taiyong, who joined the Revolutionary Party meeting in Ueno Park in Japan back in 1906, and was later detained by Japanese police on orders of the Qing embassy. When he was caught, he was found wearing a black and white Sheny, sort of like the big figure there. And when questioned where was he from, he said he was from China. But then the Japanese replied, "You don't look like a Qing person to me. What social class are you?" And he said, "I am a Yimin, or remnant citizen," which basically means that he was not part of the Qing Empire. And frustrated, the Japanese couldn't arrest him, just let him go. But overall, after the fall of the Qing dynasty came a short period when Western dress, Manchu dress, and the revival of Han dress collided into this new social reality where everything is possible in China. So the new dress code was up in the air, and it was anyone's game. But overall, what was to be the new dress for the new Chinese nation state was pretty much still fuzzy. And even the term of traditional Han dress was only compiled through fragments of imagination coming from paintings, books, and stage drama. Therefore, there is no absolute clear definition of what exactly this Han dress would be. And ultimately, in the early Republican period, HANFU was abandoned by society as a contender for modern Chinese clothing after the downfall of Yuan Shikai, the major warlord who later became president of the Republic of China, who later declared himself emperor, but found that was totally unpopular, and he died with a broken heart in 1914. And shortly after that, Han Chinese clothing, whom Yuan Shikai used during certain heaven sacrificial ceremonies in 1912 and 1913, ultimately brought this clothing to its demise because of the unpopular image it was attached with Yuan Shikai and having an emperor again in China. So after the downfall of Yuan Shikai came a whole century of twists and turns for what is to be Chinese fashion history. In the direct aftermath of Yuan Shikai, until 1949, the Republic of China still recognizes Han Chinese clothing to some extent. Namely, it is used specifically by religious Confucians who would wear the exact same thing, the black and white Sheny robes, in delegation and meetings or conferences with other Confucians, namely with Japanese and Korean delegates as well. As well, they were Chinese robes, the cross-colored robes, were used as academic garb, such as in this image here of 1930, Yanjing University. We have a humanities and social science student dressed in Han Chinese clothing academicals. But outside of the academic society, things were changing very quickly. For example, after World War I in Europe, then came the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles include that the Shandong Peninsula was to be marked off, which was formerly German colonial territory, to be sold off, or at least given off, to the Japanese as part of the indemnities incurred onto the German Empire. And as a result came a whole social movement in China demonstrating against this, and it was known as the May 4th movement. And the May 4th movement brought a whole set of modernization philosophy into China, and Manchu-style outfits with slight modifications to accommodate for Western fashion at the time became the new image of Chinese progressivism, and it is now best known as the student outfits of the May 4th Revolution. as seen in this image here, that became representative of the time. And after that, in the 1930s, when the roaring 20s of the West was fading, and as a security measure, most of the real assets of the world, namely silver, traveled to China as a form of investment, and it became hot money and a time for prosperity in China. At the same time, New York cosmopolitanism has rubbed off successfully with the same cosmopolitan nature of Shanghai, which was, by the way, the most cosmopolitan city in all of East Asia, and not even Tokyo could compare. As a result, the Qipao, or the Shanghai-style Qipao, is perfectly representative of the time, namely by combining the 1920s and 30s evening dress of the New York tradition with the rounded mandarin collar of Manchu clothing that later formed the basis of this new entity called the Shanghai Qipao. And later on, in World War II, this was particularly enforced as the cross-collar became associated with Japanese imperialism and the kimono. And after the onset of the new China, or in other words, the People's Republic of China, communism ideology took over, and people favored that this political ideology was to rule supreme over constructs of society and gender. Therefore, the army suit of, or later known as the Mao suit, or as well the one that came previously, the Sun Yat-sen suit, became popular, and it became the defining image of Chinese clothing for modern China. And during the height of the Cultural Revolution, Jiang Qin, or Madame Mao, suggested that the onset of revolution came along with the necessity for calling to a nationalistic spirit. Jiang Qin designed a new type of dress that was inspired by the cross-collared robes, whom she called the glamorous Tang dynasty. And so this cross-collared dress was designed and was called the Jiangqing dress, which was widely manufactured but never quite widely distributed because it was really demanding to the wearer's physique. Namely, it only looked good on people who were slim. And ultimately, after the death of Mao Zedong, came to the arrest of the Band of Four, of which was spearheaded by none other than Jiang Qin, or Madame Mao herself. So, after the downfall of Mao Zedong and the Gang of Four, the Jiang Qin dress was quickly swept under the rug and never to be heard from again. And with the open reforms of China by Deng Xiaoping in 1976, came a whole set of revitalizing Chinese economy and the cultural identity of China. And the People's Republic did so by primarily importing pop culture and finances and infrastructure from Hong Kong. And this was the turning point in which Manchu dress combined with Western exoticism, that was pretty much the development of Hong Kong culture in mid-century, was re-imported back into China and was considered the original Chinese culture, and yet it was a fad. And beginning with the late 1990s, saw the rise of Chinese designers entering the global fashion stage, and they sought for this principle of taking the crucial elements of Chinese culture and then putting them as elements into their clothing design. Hence, late 1990s to early 21st century clothing design, as we see on the lower right corner, involves in a primarily Western avant-garde design that mixes with certain symbology and semiotics of the Chinese traditional culture that was often criticized by scholars and designers from the West alike to be unrepresentative because it simply did not look like anything. Here I quote from Simona Seger-Reinach. Today, a new generation of Chinese fashion designers is torn between the criticism of facile exoticisms, fictional identities, and Orientalism, to which they often yield, to this weight of an Orientalism sold back to their own people. Others search for an authentic Chineseness, whilst they simultaneously negotiate their slight familiarity with the industrial production run by the state and the powerful competition of European brands. They are placed under pressures quite different from a student designer in Sydney or Seattle. As Antonia Finlay writes in a more general sense, quote again, one impediment to the more creative deployment of historical aesthetics in fashion in the arts more broadly in China is the tight grip maintained by the ruling Communist Party on the interpretation of history and culture. Hence, when this phenomenon of this legacy of the late Qing Empire and Western Oriental exoticism is brought in, a counter-movement was brought in online, discussing the whole nature. So first came the rise or the advent of Chinese early bulletin board systems, of which one of them was the famous Sino-Military Forum, or beforehand it was called the Jianchuan BBS. And then it was seen as a continuation of post-Tiananmen or post-1989 students' uprising thought, where Western democracy would save China. After the Tiananmen crackdown, the direction shifted drastically, thinking that Western democracy nor communism, in other words, any Western thought, could save China because China is unique. Therefore, they must search to their own roots. And in the 1990s, the primary thought was to revive Confucianism or any form of traditional Chinese thought back into the mainstream of Chinese intellectual sphere so that the intellectual basis could save China by devising a new method for the restoration of Chinese superiority in the world. Of which key figures or key themes brought into play included things like soft power, in other words, cultural influence, as well as nationalism and sense of national pride. One of the extremities was these forms of nationalism taking place on the Sino-Military Forum and later on HANNet or HANWang. In contrast, the pro-Marxist or pro-Maoist line of thought continued into these new forms of leftist discussion boards, such as Utopia BBS or Wu You Zhi Xiang in Mandarin. But most important of all was the transfer of this discussion off of the generic forums and into its own specialized forum discussion on the racial issues of the Han, with the starting of HANWang in 2000. Of which in 2002, a lengthy essay, or should I say photo essay, was written by someone under the alias Hua Sheny in 2002, and it was called A Lost Civilization, the Han Ethnic Clothing, and it introduces, once again, the concept or the necessity to bring back Han Chinese clothing as an important identity marker for the Chinese civilization. And this resonated very quickly when in August, someone by the name of Wang Yuliang, or alias Chinatowns, an overseas student studying in Sydney, Australia, decided to create his own version of traditional Chinese dress, snapped a photo of himself, and put it online. He received much praise, and encourage other people to do the same, preferably within the boundaries of the People's Republic. And so, in November 2003, a person by the name of Wang Letian, an electrical engineer from Zhengzhou, smack dab in the middle of China, purchased his set of HANFU from a maker nearby, and later stepped out onto the streets, took the bus, did some shopping, and walked around all day in this clothing, all the time with two photographers snapping pictures of him and posting them online as the event unfolded. This caused, well, literally no response from the mainland stream of media, but the Straits Times, or in Singapore, the Headwear picked up this story and ran it onto the, it was the Lianhe Zaobao, I'm sorry. Ran this story on its newspapers on November 26, 2003, and the article was transferred back onto the internet into China, and it went viral. Within a few months, Hanwang, or Hanian.cn, rose from roughly 10,000 members to over 200,000 within 2 months. So, what is this HANFU movement that transpired out of this? Roughly, it is a plea or a manifesto, if you will, to reinstate the traditional understanding of HANFU from a dynastic set of clothing into a living fashion system. So in other words, instead of certain dynasty clothing, you now have a wide variety of traditional designs classified by its shape and form and function. So for example, on this top table here, you have them classified by design. So you'll get to see them later on in another subsequent slide. And HANFU by functionality would be like formal clothing, semi-formal, casual, sports, not HANFU. So they define what is HANFU and what is not HANFU in a very meticulous classification or taxonomy of this kind of traditional clothing, including its imitators and detractors. And as I said previously, it was basically the primary antagonist in this whole thing is to overthrow the stereotype or the misunderstanding of this kind of clothing as ancient dress. And this can actually be reflected even in English books. Namely, in the 1980s, a bunch of scholarship was translated from China and into English, forming these well-known books from the original authors, for example, Hua Mei or Gao Chunming, or so forth. So one of the examples they have is right here. You have 3 women, basically taken out directly from paintings of its noted time. So you have this Song dynasty, Yuan dynasty, Ming dynasty, clothing for women, and it's taken out from the paintings of the time. So I would like you to focus on this Ming dynasty clothing on the rightmost or in the center of the slide. It says, Ming dynasty restoration of native rule. Yuan customs are abolished. And you see the clothing design right here, but it really does not represent anything about our current understanding of Ming Chinese clothing, because it really does not look anything like that. As you can see here, it really does not look like that. So the problem of the 1980s scholarship is that they focus too much on visual arts history, and they overlook a very simple fact that Chinese painters like to have an imagined past and an imagined past fashion as well. So clothing that was painted in paintings in the Ming Dynasty certainly did not reflect the social truth of Ming Dynasty fashion at the time, unless, of course, it was paintings of the people of the time. So, what exactly is this new understanding of HANFU in this current perspective? Let us take a look from the eyes of the activists today. So, HANFU, in today's sense, is a modern living practice of wearing Han Chinese clothing in our social context, whether it be it's formal, ritual, or social situation. So what is HANFU? HANFU, or Han, Chinese identify themselves by their clothing, or Huaxia, as early as the 7th century BCE, namely with Guangzhong and Confucius, both without Guangzhong actually wearing our collars left. But HANFU first appeared in the history books by 1st century CE, and it's basically cross-collar design to the right, tied with sashes, is cut in a flat-laid shape, 2D cutting. It's easy to make, and it fits various body shapes beautifully with the same piece of clothing. So a piece of clothing can be worn by a very large person or a very thin person, despite it being the same piece of clothing exactly. But wait, whatever happened to this design of clothing then? It's also Chinese, technically, but it belongs to another ethnicity known as the Manchus. And the reason why this became so representative of Chinese clothing is because the Manchu Empire, or the Qing, ruled China from 1644 to 1911, and of which the three decades in between basically saw the half of China being massacred in order to get the pure order going. And in 1911, scholars in China tried to bring it back, and in the early 21st century, Chinese people today are searching for their own heritage and trying to bring it back in sense of peace and equality, and dividing their lines once and for all with the imperialist stereotypes by a de-colonizing movement and de-imperializing movement in China. One of the questions that Chinese people often ask, that they think that wearing HANFU is shameful, is that doesn't HANFU look Japanese or Korean? The answer is, well, they should. So Korean and Chinese clothing look similar to Han Chinese clothing is because many aspects of Korean and Chinese culture were influenced by the very powerful dynasties of medieval China, and therefore East Asian culture looks generically like the Han Chinese one, as it was the basis of all of East Asian culture, including Vietnam. So a quick pictorial guide on the different designs of Han Chinese clothing. First we have Ichang, which are basically cross-colored tops and skirts. They're applicable for both men and women, and they can be tucked in or not tucked in. And then aside from skirts, we also have trousers, which are in Chinese hu. We also have long single-cut robes, which are called pao. They come in various type of shapes and sizes. They can be worn for various occasions, and they're also of different makes, and they are very creative when we're talking about the whole creative history of China. Next, we have the formal clothing, the Sheny or deep robe, which is basically sewing together the top and bottom together. So the yi and the shang, the top and the skirt, sewn together. Next, we have shaofu or headwear, which can come in a variety of different types. And then we also have shoes, or zufu, footwear. And finally, who can live without underwear? 鞋衣. So let's start off with the first thing, the Ichang. The top and skirt style is applicable for both men and women, and it is usually the most formal or ritual design. So it only is worn for most formal of events, and it is considered the morning ritual dress, as there's a saying, 沈衣裳, or 夜深衣, which means morning top and skirt style, and evening style is the joined 沈衣. The top piece is cross-collared, and for women, the style is specifically also called 如裙. And further on, this ru is further specified into the lined all, or the unlined shan. And these terms exist or is passed down right to this day, as Cantonese people also call their clothing in general sam. Next we have the top and trouser style. So aside, if you don't want to wear a skirt, there's also trousers or pants. They're usually for work, sport, or play. And they're also usually worn underneath more formal designs. And the commoner or outerwear version of it is called shuhe. And the middlewear are usually called middle clothes or zhongyihu. And they are usually clothing for children before they come of age. And people can wear this for every situation in daily life. Very convenient clothing design, may I add. Next we have the Sheny, or the deep robe, literally. It is the most ritualized design for men and women, as its specifications are outlined in the Yili, or the Book of Rites. And as traditionally the evening dress, it is purportedly designed by Huang Di over 4,700 years ago by sewing the top yi and the shang together into one robe, and it is the default uniform of scholar literates, or Confucians, in other words. By the way, I play this instrument right there. It's called a kuqin. The Sheny comes, as I said, with a whole slew of definitions and meanings, and is defined in the rituals of Zhou as well as the Yili, the Book of Rites. So for example, it's made of 4 panels at the top, representing 4 seasons. The skirt is made of 12 panels of fabric, meaning the 12 months. The back seam goes from top to bottom and is basically representing the rope for straightness and justice. The square collar, or the square angle collar, basically represents round heaven and square earth. The sleeves go past the fingertip and back to elbow length, basically equals to the length of your height when you put it straight down. And then different collar types represent the different status of your family. So for example, if your father or grandfather is still alive or if you're in mourning. Next we have paofu, or long robes. They are usually worn by men, but women wear as well. And it is the most creative design for in all of the entire HANFU pantheon, as it has round collars, cross collars, square collars, everything. They are usually held together by knob buttons, as well as sashes. They're worn as outer coats or even on its own, but they can have long sleeves or they may have none. They can be loosely defined, therefore, as a full-length cut, but there are bottom cuts such as this Lanshan design as well. But despite its proper look, they are only considered casual or semi-formal clothing at best. So, Sheny and Isha are still the most formal designs. So some examples of robe design include, for example, the yuanlingpao, or the round-collared robe, as well as the daopao xingyi, which I have this exactly right here for people to try. It's the Taoist robe or the travel robe, as well as the hecang, or peifeng, which are overcoats worn for winter. It is considered improper to wear these as a method of adding to the formality of your outfit. Next we have the beixing, which are vests, and the yesa, which is a very interesting robe design, as it was imported from Mongolian jisun robe designs, and it was later indigenized into Chinese designs. Next we have headwear. There are generally 4 major categories, namely with the guan, or the hard coronets, worn in formal or ritual situations, or the soft gauze caps, or jin, or headscarves. And then there is the similar type mao, or the brimmed and pre-shaped hats. And then we have hairpins for both men and women. So zhan and chai are technical terms for single or dual-pronged hairpins. And after the head, we have your feet. The Chinese believe that both head and head to toe are called clothing. But, so therefore they're generally made of cloth, but wood and leather are sometimes also used. So you have the definition of xie, or shoes. It's still used today, it's just shoes. And then you have the ji, or wooden clogs, or sandals. Then it's usually worn during the rain. Next we have xue, or boots. Most of these Chinese terms are still used today. And then you have bo, socks. Same thing. And then these are the more unique designs, which are worn usually when you have long robes or skirts. So for example, the boat shoes, lü, or single layer boat shoes, as well as the one with the big toes, the xi design, or multi-layered boat shoes. These designs are not unique to the Chinese, by the way. You will find them all across to Europe. And we also have, aside from outerwear, also underwear, which are very crucial. So first of all, we have the zhongyi, which is the inner shirt that you wear inside, as well coupled with trousers or skirt, 中户 or 中裙. And then we have the long robe inside as well, also called 中单. And then underwear, covering the front abdomen, existed for both male and female, so it's not just a bra for women. And there are many interesting designs over the course of history, but interestingly, the important point is that they're all rectangular in shape, and it's only during the Mongolian and Manchu period that they're put on a diagonal bias. Now, you see a lot of beautiful designs for HANFU. How exactly do you wear them? So you basically tie the sashes inside together in a live knot. So you first tie the left side knots first under your left armpit, and then your right side on the outer side of your right armpit. For skirts, you tie them together with long sashes at the waist after wrapping them around. And you have trousers, basically the same thing, but you press and fold the extra bits back inside, and then you roll them out for extra security. So if you want to know more about how to wear HANFU or how the HANFU revival movement is doing, please Wikipedia or Google it up. There's plenty of information and it's always evolving. It's particularly good if you can type or search in Chinese. I'll do a bit of shameless plugging. The Toronto Guqin Society is by far the most detailed information online in English regarding the movement. And if you can type in Chinese, of course, please search in Chinese. And these are the major sites that you can go to, including Baidu Tieba, which most of the information regarding the HANFU movement is located, as well as hanminzu.com, less active nowadays. And remember that when you're wearing HANFU, the ultimate purpose of wearing this is that you wear it because it's beautiful, and wearing HANFU is cool, it'll get you a lot of girls. And, but it's also important that it's not all just play. You need to remind people why you're wearing HANFU, why it's important to show wearing HANFU is important to you. HANFU is very hip and it is modern, not ancient. It always existed. HANFU is diverse, and when you're wearing a HANFU, it's about wearing it for the sake of being a responsible Chinese and a responsible citizen of the world. Whatever the occasion, there's always the right type of HANFU to wear. So be sure, like any other clothes that you wear, you need to wear for the right occasion. So this sums up the activist view of description of the HANFU movement and HANFU in general. Thanks for watching, and now we will move to the break time where we will introduce our models as well as some designs, which you just saw on the slideshow. So if everyone who is wearing HANFU care to come up and give a quick spin for everyone to take a look, or if you would like to wear HANFU, please also come up, and where we have several pieces for people to try out. Thanks. If someone can turn on the front lights just for a moment.
这是什么工作？
Just go.
我在这。
So we have a lot of fine specimens we have today. Right. So we have basically a bit of everything. So first of all, we have the Isha, or the top and skirt design. They're everywhere. Top and skirt design. Top and skirt design. Top and skirt design. Top, not you. Top and skirt design. All of these here, basically. Over half of them are top and skirt design. Very common, and it's not unique to the Chinese. Most cultures have top and skirt designs, and it's pretty straightforward. The defining factor is that Chinese clothing tends to be cross-collared to the right. And great. Next we have the Sheny, or the deep robe design, which is basically a top and skirt, but sewn together at the waist. Okay, so when if everyone would just step one step forward. Thanks. You too. So there are two major designs of There are two major designs of Sheny. The default design is basically a straight corners turn here like this. And this is called the straight hem Sheny, or the default Sheny. There's a bunch of other technical names if you want to get detailed with it. But the most interesting thing is that beginning with the HANFU movement of our era, an ancient design, which was basically fallen out of use by 4th century AD, came back, namely with this, the Juju, or the curved hem Sheny. Very useful. So the unique thing about this is it's available for both men and women, but then the hem that you see that sort of extends and droops here, well, they've emphasized that and made it even longer. So if they made it very long, then that means that they can circle around the body several times, and when that's pulled, it creates a diagonal drag effect that creates the spiraling hem, which is very beautiful. And it's especially popular with young girls today because it emphasizes the figure of their bodies, particularly at the waist and the hips. Some other unique designs, aside from the standard cross-collar design, is sorry, might you come up with the Yuan Paul, as well as the quarter. So beginning with the Ming Dynasty, we begin to see a lot more variations in HANFU design. And one of which is this square collar with the gold locks buttoned up. The difference between Qing design and Ming design is that the Ming designs, or the Han Chinese designs, tend to have a smaller button profile, so no frog buttons with this long strip of string that goes all the way across like this. No, the Chinese do not, the Han Chinese don't like that. They want to keep their buttons as hidden and as small as possible. Same thing goes for late Ming. And with buttons, you can have a lot of different variations, ranging from the round collar to the square collar.
It's made of the buttons.
The buttons are made of cloth, usually of the same material, so you don't see it here. Or sometimes they may be made of gold and silver. They are also sometimes made of pearl and whatever materials you can think of. Sure. And just to recap on the top and skirt design, with an example of a Qiyao and a Gongyao. Oh, cool, we have trousers too. So, forward. So, nowadays for casual design, we have a lot of fanciful variations, from anywhere from trousers, if you would do a spinning base, all the way to skirts of every length, namely from my waist length to chest length, there are many different ways of wearing your outfits of clothing. Whether you wear them cross-colored, parallel colored, low waist, high waist, you name it. In other words, Han Chinese clothing is not one particular design or one particular dynasty, but a collected heritage of many different designs and a very vibrant history of fashion that we hope to see even more innovation in the coming centuries. So I guess I'll do enough talk now, and if anyone's interested in trying, I guess I could pull out a few more outfits.
I have a few as well.
Sure. Of this HANFU movement. So ultimately the HANFU movement is driven initially by Hanism, a form of nationalism, particularly attached with race. In fact, this is the reason why a lot of people grew scared of the HANFU movement in the beginning. But what is Hanism, or Han Weijuyi? So, Han departmental thought, or Han cultural departmentalism, or simply Hanism, is an ideology based on the interests of the Han Chinese race or ethnic group. The Han are considered to be the foundation of China and Chinese culture. Han culture is the basis of Chinese culture, as I said. Hans should develop self-respect, confidence, and affirmation towards the value of Han culture, while proactively absorbing the virtues of other cultures to enrich its own. And basically, Hanism existed in the early 2000s of the Chinese intellectual scape to contrast itself with two other major schools of thought, which to philosopher Song Yuren suggested that aside from the Han school, there's also this construct known as the Tartar school, which he defines as looking Chinese and built with Chinese elements, but is built on the principle that Han Chinese identity does not exist or is not the most important factor, but rather the snowball effect of Chinese culture with other foreign cultures in the world, acclimating itself and expanding itself is the primary role and identity. So it's distinctly different from the Han Chinese. And ultimately we have the other contrast, which is the West, which comprises everything from Marxism to fascism. So your typical Western political ideology from the extreme left to the extreme right, everything. But in any case, this, when put into the Chinese context, forms its own school and competes with traditional Chinese ideology that has a completely different set of political and cultural agendas. But it is important to understand that Hanism is not expressly or in itself a form of xenophobia or chauvinism. Rather, it is, why did I just say that? It's because of Mao Zedong actually wrote a treatise on going against Han chauvinism, but never having defined what Han chauvinism or big Hanism, 大汉族主义, what it really means. So for decades, it's become a hot keyword, but nobody has quite the exact definition of what it means to be Han and supremacist. But at the same time, there is a competing ideology to which some call pan-Zhonghua-ism or 泛中华主义, which we now some Hanists call as the Tartar school, basically saying Chinese identity is the consummate identity of all the ethnicities who live in China currently in its political borders are then considered Chinese. The Han or the Hanists attack the idea by saying we have ethnic Koreans, Russians, Kyrgyz, and even Portuguese living in Macau. Is that to say that then Korean history, Russian history, and Portuguese history are part of Chinese history? With this, they believe that the whole ideology by this so-called Tartar pan-Zhonghua school as a farce, and suggest that ultimately there needs to be one culture that is the basis of the defining trait, which is Han, or Chinese in general. And when we talk about ancient China, it's basically Han culture, and is the defining culture that has basically illuminated and positioned our sense of history, aesthetics, and culture. Therefore, Hanism is basically the understanding that this thing we have, known as the Han, and the people and the culture of it, no matter what region they may reside in, is the fundamental basis of what we call Chineseness. And this is to put into another narrative of modernization in China, where the understanding of modernity in China since the 20th century is immediately relegated to westernization. And this is from a long string of historical causes, including Qing weakness and the invasion of Western powers into China and creation of treaty ports and concession zones, and even into the Republic and People's Republic. The understanding of what is modern or what is hip, the trend or fads that's created around the world, everything that is new must be based on some form or principle, whether it be aesthetic, political, ideological, whatever, to be some part based on understanding of the West. And Hanism is fundamentally against that by suggesting that the Han are capable of creating its own modernity without having to base itself on Western principles or values. So in one case, you can also argue that Hanism, in a more moderated or moderate sense, is a form of post-colonialism, or a decolonial intent. But this kind of thought has seen a lot of opposition, especially given the sensitive nature of its ideology. So, despite popular support online and in Chinese cities since 2006 and later beyond, the problem of misrepresentation is then run rampant as this ideology completely conflicts with the understanding of ethnicity as proposed by the Zhonghua Minzu policy in the People's Republic of China. So one way of subverting this is through the representation or re-representation through mass media. So here we have all kinds of smearing involved. So, for example, Hanism, or Han 本位主义, is classified as a dangerous thought, on par with neo-Nazism. And the debate of race, nation, or even Han chauvinism is considered taboo for most people, and most people don't even talk about it. And in mass media, there are particular incidents where media portrays these people as eccentric or as strange people. So for example, here, in this news article, the title is from, let's see, Chutian Metro in Hubei Province, Wuhan. This says, HANFU 妹子行汉服婚礼，结姻结法. Anyway, in English, it would be insignificant anyway, but the important thing is, look here in the bold, HANFU. This term here is particularly put in quotation marks. And you'll find that this is particularly common amongst mainland Chinese literature as well as blog articles, but mostly on books and newspapers. Namely, that HANFU is not considered something normal. It is not a commonly understood term. Therefore, they're put into quotation marks and therefore exoticized. In the second incident, where they talk about a bunch of people wearing HANFU, this says, also from Wuhan and Tangzhuang, they're called time travelers. Wuhan 现穿越歌穿汉服指汉奸去上课. So in English, it would translate to something like, in Wuhan, there was a sudden appearance of a brother time traveler, where he wears HANFU and holding Han sword and goes to class. So he would be portrayed as this anachronism, this person who seems completely out of place with his time, and suddenly appear in this, smack dab in this new Chinese society that is in all respects out of place. And that's how the media portrays, for the most part, people who are Han proponents and activists. So for a person who's living in China, times are definitely not good. And aside from this media misrepresentation, there are also other issues, which often ends up in different forms of violence. So for example, there are verbal violence. In here, we see, this is the original article from Xinjiang in Beijing. It says, HANFU meeting. And then somehow online, later there is a alternative that came up as the bottom article. It says, 寿衣商界, which basically means joss or funeral clothing takes to the streets. So this is obviously slander or a parody, and it resulted in the litigation against Sony Limited, the original server which this image came from, and it resulted in a court case, but then the defendant never showed up as the company dissolved itself under the litigation. And then there is psychological damage and violence, where you have, in this picture here, a girl, a grade 11 girl in Yongkang, Anhui province, China. So she's in grade 11, she decides to wear HANFU one morning to school. She's holding her breakfast, walking down the corridor, and she gets laughed at by a lot of students, fellow classmates. But the kicker is, by lunchtime, she was sent home by her school principal because of her dress. She argued, now, why can the minor ethnicities in China, the ethnic minorities, can wear their own clothing and it's completely socially acceptable, but when the Han Chinese wear their own clothing, it's considered out of place and anachronistic. And as a result, this image, as well as this news article, ran rampant, and the school system was heavily criticized for being intolerant of its own culture. But most of all, and most importantly, is physical violence, where historical views not pertaining to the honest view of things, or when people wearing the clothing itself get attacked, this is the most obvious and most critical of violence that can be induced onto people trying to express their identity. Here we have a young HANFU promoter / seller who slapped a 74-year-old historian, Yan Chongnian, who was a famous Manchu Qing era scholar, for basically whitewashing history and saying that the Manchu coming into China was a glorious coming together of the Manchu and Han races for the betterment of the Chinese race in the future. And with this kind of historical view, Huang Haiqing, the man above, bought one of his books, went to a book signing event, got his book signed, said, "Thank you," and then proceeded to slap the guy twice in the face. He was fined 1,000 Chinese yuan and detained for 15 days. This was the maximum penalty for a common assault against another person without serious physical harm. And it was from this case that brought to public view that Chinese historiography or revisionist historiography, as promoted by the Chinese official government, was seriously under fire and question by the foreign as well as local civilian academia. In the West, such as Toronto here, we do not recognize the Chinese understanding that the Yuan or the Qing or the Mongols and the Manchu are actually formally Chinese. So when foreign history books get translated and passed into China, they would have to go under heavy censorship and have to annotate every mention of this kind of historiography as politically incorrect in China for the sake of the Chinese ethnic policy. As well as popular nationalism in China also comes to serious effect when, remember when I said in the 1940s, the Chinese particularly wore Manchu designs in order to distinguish themselves from the cross collars of the Japanese. This has extended right to today when in 2009, September, a girl by the alias of Sun Ting was walking down Chengdu and was eating in a fast food restaurant you see here, when a large anti-Japanese, Diaspora, Senkaku Islands dispute thing, was passing by. It was like around 1,000 strong. Notice that someone was wearing a cross-collared robe inside a fast food restaurant sitting by the glass window. Went inside and said, "Take off your Japanese clothes now." And the woman, Sun Ting, tried to explain, "No, this isn't Japanese, this is Chinese, I'm as patriotic as you are." And the representative from the crowd said, "I don't care, I need to deal with the sentiments of the angry comrades I have here." The result was, she was forcefully stripped of her Chinese clothing, paraded on the platform outside of the restaurant, and subsequently burned. Since digital photographs of this whole event happened, as well as some videos, this event was later passed through the internet and became an international laughingstock. And it shows that this new form, or popular form of Chinese nationalism, did not particularly favor or recognize traditional understanding of Chineseness, but rather their own form of Chinese pride comes from the attack or detriment of the Japanese, something that the Hanism movement is particularly enthusiastic at dispelling, because the HANFU movement enforces Chineseness rather than attacks another race or another culture in order to enforce their own pride. So, from this incident, a new conclusion can be drawn, that Hanism is against this new entity formed against the People's Republic of China government, which they called later Qing, because it suppresses, or does not officially formalize or recognize Han culture as the culture of the Han, quite ironically, and subsequently as a part of the official party-recognized narrative of Chinese culture. And hence, Hanism in its more dissentful forms takes a new reinterpretation of the slogan 反清复明, or vanquish the Qing and restore the Ming, or Ming loyalism, into popular reference. In other words, Ming loyalism, or loyalism to a dynasty that existed from the 14th century to the 17th, suddenly has reference and relevance in the 21st. Ironic, funny, or just plain odd? You be the judge, but then this is now the political situation in China. So aside from the more destructive forms of nationalism, Hanism tries to bring itself into terms with an increasingly globalized society. And one of the most important treatises was written up by the administrator of the bulletin board system, Baidu HANFU bar, and his alias was Qipao. And he passed away at the age of 30 in 2006. But before he passed away, he wrote a treatise called HANFU should be a new citizen movement. Here are some sections. HANFU should be a new citizen movement thing, as it is in itself the product of spiritual independence. It should create a group of people with increasing spirit of independence and critical thinking. In other words, it promotes critical thinking and individuality. HANFU is a new citizen movement because it creates a group of citizens with world-class confidence and acceptance. HANFU should be new citizen as it should support grassroots movements and has power with mighty force. And it is to actualize an unprecedented reawakening of civilization and civility. And this basically proves a transition of the HANFU movement from a nationalistic one into one of global awareness. So in other words, it is from a sense of antagonism or establishing the other by violent means or traditional forms of nationalism into one of peaceful nature in outlooks for future society. And different places bring with different issues or different implementations of the HANFU movement. So how does the HANFU movement look like in real life? And the answer is, it depends on different places. And for different places, you have different social contexts. So it's difficult to measure how successful is each group. But we know, for example, for definite, that the final measure of success is broad acceptance and application. So meaning people recognize and wear HANFU. And that is the ultimate goal of the Han Chinese clothing movement. But ultimately these promotional individuals or groups are limited by their access of financial or cultural capital or resources. So for example, how much money and how good clothes you can buy, or whether you have the cultural resources, namely how much government cooperation do you have, what social environment does each place have in order for you to promote, or how much command of the language each person has in order to promote the language to the local masses becomes an issue. So here are some case examples. For example, in larger cities like Shanghai or Kunming in Yunnan, you have incorporated associations which are registered as companies because in China, all organizations are either registered as a government organization or as a private commercial organization. There is no such thing as a non-government not-for-profit organization. All of them have to be registered as a commercial enterprise. And HANFU is no different. And for other places, they are trying different methods by not going the registered way and leaving it to a grassroots type of democracy where they have their own elections, something that's not observed except for the most basic levels in China. They're trying to experiment that this is a new form of democracy by having intra-organizational democracy and organization with their planning of events and promotion. And then you have places such as Toronto and other diaspora communities where each organization is so small and so removed that for every event that they do, they basically have to enter into an inter-organizational cooperative. The Toronto Association for the Revival HANFU, the association here, often has to cooperate with modeling companies, the Ontario and federal government, as well as local festivals in order to organize an event, for example. Oh, by the way, that's the first long article in Toronto regarding the HANFU movement, and you can see who started it. And then there's a recent very special case called Malaysia, where they have an integrated organization, so it's still cooperative with other organizations, but it's integrated into one large organization where they promote, produce, and propagate the understanding of HANFU in one large social movement. In other words, they are the most coherent ones while organized as a non-profit organization in Malaysia. So this is right now seen as the ideal model that other people are looking up to. And you can sort of see that with the scale of the events that they're running, it's very impressive. So the HANFU movement is, first of all, supported by nationalists, staunch nationalists, who believe that Han culture should be unique and individual should be expressed. But ultimately it spread to a bunch of people who are not as hardcore about that, and it evolved into something that is more than just liking clothing or a nationalist ideology. Later, it became a form of lifestyle for us all. For many of us, wearing HANFU is a special thing, but special in the case not that it becomes a occasion in life, but rather even experiencing the very mundane moments in life as a Chinese person. So, who were the first supporters of the HANFU movement? And the first people include guzheng players and artists, performing artists, of this thing called the New Classical Style. So, antiquity retro is sort of the fad amongst youth in China right now. And if you want to talk about youth consumer culture, it's about representing accurately a lifestyle of the ancient dynasties. Right now is quite the popular thing amongst Chinese youth. So the past in China is hardly something left for just academia. It is a vibrant consumer community. As well, you have the more well-known fields of wushu and martial arts. Kung Fu people love this stuff because it is particularly integrated with this understanding or image of traditional Chinese. Some people are trying to, in China, to overthrow the bias or the discrimination of wearing HANFU, which they call antique clothes, and they're trying to overthrow this by saying that this is normal daily life, and they do so by wearing this at home and at work, not just for fun and for cultural events. This is taking one step further. And finally, there are government initiatives. So city municipal governments promoting in tourism campaigns or in international competitions and so forth. HANFU is increasingly being seen as a representative face of the traditional heritage of China. And in case you're wondering who these guys are, these are the top tennis players of the world wearing HANFU. So in a short summary of everything that we've talked tonight, the HANFU movement is a material extension initially of nationalism. And the discourse of this form of nationalism is rebuilding, in a sense, a vocabulary and a concept of contemporary ethnic dress, which was previously absent in the dialogue or discourse of Chinese fashion. And that includes the Chinese community outside of the People's Republic of China. We're talking about the global Chinese community. It is a form of transition to talk about the experiences, the traumas of Chinese heritage from the nationalist perspective to one of integrating with the global society, one of a new citizen movement. And it is a dialogue and updating this concept or this perceived imagination of traditionalism into a new form of globally accepted universal values. For example, one of the most outstanding examples, Chinese traditional values is particularly open to LGBT people. This is unheard of until the HANFU movement, when people, once again, we bring out that this Chinese traditionalism is not this conservative American fascist set of values that looks down on everything that is outside of the gender binary. No. The diverse social, the complex social nature of medieval China actually is quite open, and they bring up different examples for this, proves that through the expression of wearing HANFU, they're bringing an idea that traditional China may not be as you think it is. In fact, it could be quite open and up for definition. And the second part that's most important to understanding HANFU and the HANFU movement up to now is an evolution of ideology from material culture, from ideology into material culture, I'm sorry. So they're moving away from just pure talk and politics. They are establishing trends, material fads, as well as fashions. And they're establishing a chain for relevant interests and industries for consumption. And ultimately, it sort of feeds back into the ideology thing again, into a very familiar notion which we call multiculturalism in Europe and North America. So if anyone's familiar with this poster from the STAR campaign, I forgot which university, it was somewhere in mid-US, but it shows different people of different ethnicities holding up pictures of stereotypical outfits or costumes of their own culture, and it says, no, this is not who I am, and this, namely the costume and the stereotypicalization, is not okay. For the most Chinese people, this is a foreign concept, and they are not yet familiarized with the concept of cultural tolerance, let alone cultural acceptance, and this is basically the primary struggle of the HANFU movement, as the discriminated body is pretty much from the same people as the discriminator. So this concludes pretty much the themes to cover for this lecture. And coming up next week, the question is this: if success of the HANFU movement depends on acceptance and openness of the society that it's based in, then why did the HANFU movement did not begin and thrive in the People's Republic, where it is the most oppressed, but it fails to stick and persist in the more open Chinese diaspora? So for example, Taiwan, Hong Kong, or even here in Canada. It exists, but why is it not thriving faster than, say, the People's Republic, where it is more oppressed? And that would be the topic for next week, where we talk about the current challenges, potential pitfalls, and the disputes of the HANFU movement. Thank you for attending, and I hope to see you next week.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Juni, for your wonderful lecture. And now we have like 10 minutes for Q&A. If you have any questions about today's topic or anything about Chinese culture, you can ask the speaker. You can just raise your hand and I will give you the microphone.
And after that, we can keep on trying to close.
Yeah, after that, we can keep on trying to close, and we'll have an interview session after that to talk about your feelings about today's topic. Okay.
Thank you very much for having this presentation, and very informative and very substantial presentation. I agree, as according to history, the Japanese adopted Chinese culture, various aspects, religion, thought, and of course dress and presentation. Between what in history, Japanese went to Tang Dynasty, China. The Japanese had the official missions to the Tang court to learn everything Chinese. So the HANFU has been adopted by the Japanese since Tang Dynasty time. But what intrigues me, like later down the centuries, by the Meiji Restoration, like 1800s end, the Japanese wanted to modernize and they go the Western way, so they learn everything the Western way. They deem it's the powerful way to be. But interesting, Japanese culture since the Meiji Restoration also tried to modernize or westernize. So we see that in their costume. So there is this tension or dynamism that the Japanese maintain the traditional culture, including their clothing, but then they also want to imitate the West. So there is it something good or something not good? But I think the fact shows by itself. So even now today, I think the West or the world would appreciate traditional traditional Japanese design and culture. So it's very active, very aesthetic. So what is your thought on this? That eventually China or the Han culture will also undergoes these changes, both Western and both traditional Han. Thank you.
Thank you for that information on Japan. Let's talk about that for a moment. Yeah, that's actually a very important part. First, I'll answer you on your generic question, what will happen to China? The answer is, it won't look like Japan. How is it that it won't look like Japan? In the respect that the HANFU movement itself is under very different social contexts, and from the history of the evolution of this concept of Japanese dress. Japanese dress underwent several major changes. One is the Taika reforms of the, 581 or something like that, where they learned basically and converted the entire country to gofgu, or wool area clothing, which is southern Chinese clothing. And if you go to Japan right now to buy kimono, the shop that it's called a gofgu-ya. Gofgu is wool area clothing, ya is shop. And so technically it is Chinese, but at the same time you have, throughout its history, numerous reforms where they try to indigenize this Chinese culture into their own. First of which was the Heian period. And after the Meiji Restoration of 1876, where they tried to westernize and dump everything that was Japanese, there is a rebound. It's called the Taisho Reformation. And we're talking about 1910s, 1920s. It only existed for a decade or two. But what we see there are Japanese schoolgirls wearing traditional gofgu with their hakama, and they would wear Western boots. This is a very unique situation where they are trying to come to compromise that they can be advanced and imperial and strong as they want, at the same time being proud and be able to represent themselves as a modern power through their own traditional dress. So ultimately, it is a matter of their national perceived sense of power, whether that be hard power expressed in military might or soft power in the acceptance of their culture from around the world. So if you think of 1920s Japan, Japanese culture is quite accepted in Europe. And it's from this kind of confidence that the Japanese would wear their clothing, traditional clothing out again. But in the modern sense, Japanese clothing is more prevalent amongst the female fashion right now. Whereas in most situations, take for example New Year's Day, you would see most Japanese females were in furisode, but then at the same time, men would be half dressed in traditional or half dressed in Western casual clothing. And same thing goes with Korea, where the men are often wearing Western clothing, and the women would be wearing traditional clothing, and you have this undertone that Eastern tradition is perceiving itself to be feminine, and therefore must be worn in the female domain. The HANFU clothing movement observes this and says, no. If we are to restore this right now, because we have a blank slate completely, we might as well restore it to the fullest extent. Therefore, we will wear HANFU, not just in the state or formal occasions, but we will also wear them for both men and women with the same prevalence, and we will wear them for every occasion possible. That is the difference between the HANFU movement, or at least how it's proclaimed, compared with the social realities of Korea and Japan, or Vietnam, or basically everywhere else in the world. So it's fighting against this monolithic, globalized culture that you can perceive as Euro-American. Next question.
Okay, do you need a microphone?
It's fine. My question is, we know that Chinese have a very long history, and right now we can generally see what the general style of HANFU looks like. But during the long period and long history, we all know that the HANFU keep its evolution. It comes from at the Cheongsam style period and coming to end at the Ming Dynasty. But my question is, how can I distinct which HANFU clothes represent the period in the history? Is there any way I can distinguish? I can recognize that?
If you want to study about Chinese period dress, then there is plenty of scholarship from the 1980s that you can read. In fact, it's what we started from. But if we're talking about the understanding of HANFU for now and for the future, the whole concept is completely turned upside down. Namely, because we have access to so much resources, namely that we have archaeological evidence, we have new diagrams, we have new books, and they're not all necessarily written by academia either. It can be grassroots archaeology and research. But because of the internet, we have so much information now that unlike the HANFU movement of the early 20th century, when people were thinking that, oh, HANFU is, or for the future should be from the martial arts dramas that we see on stage. No, nowadays, it's a very diverse and complete system that they try to bring on all the innovations and designs known from history, and they try to innovate upon this, or at least base upon this, to create this new system or umbrella term that is HANFU. So, if you want to define what HANFU is for this century and beyond, I can tell you that the distinct identity of this century is under the influence or response to Western universalism. Now, the HANFU movement brings up everything that they know about previous Chinese dress or previous Han Chinese dress, and they're reviving it in one big revelation, and that is the distinct identity of this period. Namely, all the period designs that we've seen in the past are now out, and everything's up for grabs.
Okay, last question? Okay.
Hi. So I just want to ask that, as you have mentioned, the HANFU movement right now is mostly about the grassroots movement, or just ordinary everyday citizens dressing up, and they try to promote this HANFU from their just everyday experience. And I also thought that there's also this top-down movement, as you mentioned. Some governments have initiated events for people to attend dress in HANFU, and also celebrities and more influential, for example, business people attending red carpet events dressed in HANFU is also starting to appear. So I just want to know your opinion on the pros and cons of these two approaches for promoting HANFU. Thank you.
I guess I'll start with a comment about the nature of the Chinese government today. After Deng Xiaoping's open reforms, Chinese government is basically run like a business. And as you know, business would not invest until they know that it can turn a profit. So basically, the HANFU movement did not exist, and still in some extent not a top-down movement. All those events that you see where the government is actively promoting HANFU, all of them are actually, if you know how the Confucius Institute is run here, Namely, they draw on local grassroots resources and gives them government officiation. So basically all the efforts, the material resources, so in other words the clothing and the people and so forth, are not actually government people. They're basically hired or contracted by the local government to the grassroots groups. Or they could be major media companies. I know you're thinking Feng Wenshan, so basically these groups or commercial organizations latch on and think that this is something that they can sell, and they will take on this opportunity to join the HANFU movement, yes. But it did not start from there, and from what we're gathering so far, it's not really having much effect. But the paradox is, if you don't have companies who will make and sell HANFU or create relevant media about HANFU in order to increase its awareness, where are we all going to get our HANFU from? So for those grassroots people, some of them think that commercialization is not good and it must be beaten down or whatnot. And there are those realists like me who believe that commercialization is the ultimate form where this movement will take. Because ultimately, people will not go back to the homespun economy where everyone makes their own set of clothing. Nowadays, that we live in a global commodity and e-business economy, of social media economy nowadays even, ultimately we're going to have to see that the clothing itself would have to be traded as a commercial product or good. And that is the process that we're seeing. But according to movement pundits, we haven't done it enough because there is no scale of, there's no industrial scale involved to it. All the makers right now are small ateliers. And that's the problem because in the past there actually have been several factories that tried to mass produce HANFU, but they couldn't find the market to sell them and they ultimately failed. So it's a slow process, I'm sorry to say, but we're hoping and we're working hard in order to expand this cake, and hopefully we will see HANFU readily available in stores all around the world. We're slowly seeing that, but it's still a very rare incident. Heck, is there even a HANFU brick and mortar store in Beijing? I know there's one in Chengdu and I know there's several in Guangzhou, but think about Shanghai and Beijing. There are no actual shops selling HANFU. And no, those photo studio costumes do not count.
Okay, thank you for the wonderful questions and answers. Okay, now I would like to invite the president of Nostro Society of University of Toronto, Jianpeng, to say something. Okay.
Monsieur et Mesdames, bienvenue et mon ami. Welcome today, my friend, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome everyone join our topic and welcome really San Yeung give our wonderful lecture and Wu also he introduced our association earlier, so I won't repeat it. And the most importantly, our clothing part organized and by Wu school. And she is the president of HANFU Club in UT Scarborough. Let her introduce her club a little bit.
大家好，since you will speak in French, I'll speak some Chinese. Anyway, my name is Grace. I'm from the University of Toronto Scarborough, and I am the president of Hart Chinese Culture Association down there. So what our club do is that we promote the Chinese culture in Scarborough. And I would like to thank all of you guys for coming tonight, and thanks for Uni for putting up this awesome presentation.
Thanks again, and also we will try to make a documentary about HANFU. And actually, before this event, I tried to organize like a documentary singing event But the thing is, when I search online, I cannot find any official one or any good one. So why don't we like make one like it's like a history, right? Historical movement. Also, we are part of that. So if anyone want to have interview, our director Guo is there. Hi. Anyone want to get in interview like after that? Ask him.
Or have a chat with me, essentially.
Yeah, also that. Our next lecture will be November 10th, next Sunday, and is also same building. Then there, the next topic will be there. Thanks again, and if anyone want to take any photo, do it. And also we have clothing. If anyone still want to try, come to here. We will finish. I booked this room before until 9 o'clock. So we try to end everything before 9. So enjoy the rest of time. Thank you very much.
Visuals and fashion design is up for next week, so if you're interested about that.
Oh.